Have you ever walked into a room and felt every pair of eyes silently judging you, long before anyone said a word? This is the kind of moment that can either break a person or reveal who they truly are. The night Daniel stepped into the Grand Palace ballroom, the celebration was already in full bloom. Crystal chandeliers glowed like suspended suns, music floated through the air, and elegant guests moved as if choreographed for a film. But the moment Daniel crossed the threshold, something shifted. Conversations dimmed. Curious glances sharpened. A quiet tension whispered that he did not belong. He had driven for more than 3 hours to be there. And yet, the very first obstacle met him at the door. The security guard blocked his path while everyone else walked in freely. Daniel handed him the gold-edged invitation. The man examined it again and again, searching for a flaw that wasn't there, before finally stepping aside. Inside, the atmosphere thickened with unspoken judgment. A silver-haired woman whispered to her companion, insisting she had never seen him in the family. Daniel ignored the comment, but he felt the familiar sting, the kind that hides behind polite smiles. He tried to take a seat at an empty table. A woman rushed over to stop him, claiming it was reserved, though no card or marker indicated it. Daniel moved to another table, then another. Each time, the same rejection, wrapped in a brittle smile. He finally settled in a lonely chair near the waiter's exit. No one bothered to approach him there. The servers passed repeatedly, offering champagne to every guest except him. When he asked for a glass, the waiter stammered an excuse and disappeared. And yet, through all of this, Daniel remained composed. His eyes carried a calm strength, the kind found only in someone who is prepared for a truth far greater than the insult of a cold stare. Then the bride appeared. Amanda, radiant in French lace, moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting guests with a warm smile. But when her eyes met Daniel's, her entire body froze. Her face lost its color. Her steps faltered. Without a word, she turned away, as if the very sight of him threatened to shatter the perfect image of her wedding day. Daniel noticed everything. He did not lower his gaze. He did not shrink. He simply watched. And in that moment, the real story began. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. The DJ announced the start of the godparents' dance, and elegant couples filled the floor in coordinated movements. Everything seemed perfectly arranged, including the subtle ways in which Daniel continued to be pushed to the margins of the celebration. When he approached the bar, 3 men stepped forward just enough to block his access. They pretended to be engrossed in a lively discussion about investments, laughing loudly, yet none of their eyes reflected real warmth. One of them muttered that they were busy, without even glancing at Daniel. Their bodies formed a wall that left no room to question their intentions. He moved toward the restroom, only to face another silent rearrangement. Each time he approached, the line adjusted itself. Men who arrived after him were nudged forward, sudden conversations erupted to block his path, and within minutes, he became invisible again. After waiting far too long, he simply walked out to the terrace. The cool air offered a rare moment of relief. Daniel took out his phone and sent a message saying that he had arrived as expected. The reply came instantly, urging him to document everything and reminding him that solid evidence was needed. He answered that the guests were surpassing their own reputation. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, unaware that he was being watched. From the window, Mrs. Coleman, the bride's mother, observed him with growing suspicion. She marched onto the terrace with sharp determination, her presence cutting the quiet like a blade. She told him this was a private event and claimed he should not be there alone. Her eyes scanned him with the precision of someone searching for a reason to justify her contempt. Daniel responded calmly, saying he simply needed some fresh air. She laughed coldly, accusing him of intruding and warning him to disappear before her husband called real security. She insisted that people in their circle knew one another, and he clearly did not belong. More guests gathered, forming a silent ring around him. Among them was Margaret Whitfield, who approached with a smile that held no kindness. She asked if there was a problem, but her eyes had already judged him. Mrs. Coleman replied that she was merely clarifying issues of social propriety. 8 people now watched him with the same expression, a mix of superiority and disguised discomfort. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen it in other places, with other families, always unfolding the same way. Margaret spoke to him with an almost maternal tone that carried unmistakable condescension. She told him that some people get overly excited when they receive invitations to refined events and that it was important to understand one's limits. Before Daniel could answer, the groom appeared. Robert Coleman Jr. stopped abruptly when he saw Daniel, studying him with growing discomfort. He insisted he recognized him from somewhere. Daniel replied that they had never met, but Robert's hesitation suggested otherwise. Mrs. Coleman quickly intervened, ordering her son to return to the celebration and insisting they would handle the situation. She did not realize that her reaction had just given Daniel one of the most valuable pieces of evidence of the evening. Daniel re-entered the ballroom, slipping back into the flow of the celebration as if nothing had happened. But he had noticed everything. The bride, Amanda, stood near the cake table, visibly shaken. She whispered to her bridesmaids with quick, frantic gestures. When one of them pointed discreetly toward Daniel, Amanda's head snapped in his direction. She shook her head vigorously, denying something, refusing something, terrified of something. Daniel observed her without moving. The guests around him celebrated freely, yet Amanda seemed trapped in a different world, one where panic clung to her like a second veil. Every time their eyes almost met, she retreated, hiding behind a pillar or slipping behind someone's back as though his presence alone threatened to unravel the entire day. The photographer approached Daniel with an air of annoyance, raising his camera as if Daniel were obstructing a masterpiece. He asked Daniel to step aside, claiming he was trying to capture the party without visual interference. Daniel repeated the words calmly, letting them hang in the air, knowing exactly what the man meant. His first real smile broke through, but it held no friendliness. It was a smile of recognition, a smile that said he was taking note of everything, that nothing was lost on him. He reached into his pocket and discreetly activated a small digital recorder. His experience in legal documentation had taught him that evidence captured in real time carried a weight that no testimony could match. Every whisper of prejudice, every exclusion, every false smile was now being preserved in perfect clarity. He murmured a quick test phrase under his breath. The device picked up his voice effortlessly, even through the music and chatter. His phone buzzed. A message appeared asking for updates. Daniel replied that everything was unfolding exactly as expected, perhaps even worse, and that the evidence was multiplying quickly. The response came instantly, urging him to continue gathering as much as possible before Monday. David Peterson was more than his partner at a major civil rights law firm. He was the one who had worked beside Daniel through years of brutal cases, dismantling corporations that thrived on discrimination. The case they were building now had taken 8 long months of investigation, and this wedding was the final piece, the moment where truth would collide with arrogance in a room full of witnesses. Mrs. Coleman stormed back onto the terrace, this time with reinforcements. Beside her stood Colonel Coleman, the patriarch of the family, a man whose military posture and rigid values shaped an empire built on exclusion. His voice cracked through the air with cold authority as he questioned Daniel's presence. Daniel greeted him with polite respect, addressing him formally. The colonel did not appreciate the calmness in Daniel's voice, nor the steady eye contact that suggested a man who feared nothing. He spoke of honor, of belonging, of knowing one's place. Daniel responded in a tone so measured that it unsettled the colonel more than any act of defiance would have. Mrs. Coleman pressed further, demanding to know how Daniel knew her daughter. Daniel paused before answering, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. He described their history as complex, something that required a more appropriate moment to explain. Across the ballroom, Amanda's face drained of color. She knew exactly what Daniel meant and what he was capable of revealing. Margaret Whitfield returned as well, now joined by 2 other guests who carried the same poisonous politeness. They suggested more direct measures, including calling the police or running a background check. Daniel activated his phone's high-quality recorder without drawing attention. He asked them calmly what measures they had in mind, and Margaret replied with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. The colonel threatened to call Sheriff Martinez, claiming he owed him favors and would surely remove Daniel by force if needed. Daniel repeated the sheriff's name softly, in a way that made the colonel hesitate. It carried meaning, knowledge, perhaps leverage. That hesitation marked the beginning of the unraveling. Amanda could no longer avoid what was happening. She moved across the hall with determined steps, though fear tightened every line of her face. Her wedding dress trailed behind her like a shadow she could not outrun. She ordered her parents to stop immediately, trying to sound firm, but her trembling voice betrayed everything she tried to hide. Her mother attempted to explain, but Amanda cut her off. She turned to Daniel with a strained smile, thanking him for coming and insisting the gesture was appreciated, even though her eyes revealed the exact opposite. The entire family watched in growing confusion, sensing that something deeper lay beneath the surface. Daniel bowed slightly, offering his congratulations. His words were polite, but the final phrase carried a weight that sent a shiver through the bride. She deserved exactly what her choices had brought her to this day. One of the guests demanded to know how the two were acquainted. Amanda quickly claimed they had studied together in law school. Daniel did not argue, but the faint change in his expression exposed the lie for what it was. Amanda had never expected to see him again, and now she was scrambling to rewrite history in front of her family. The colonel, already irritated, questioned why there was confusion about Daniel's presence if he was supposedly an old classmate. Amanda insisted it was all a misunderstanding, but Daniel checked his watch discreetly. Hours of recorded discrimination, threats, lies. The evidence had already grown beyond anything the family could contain. His phone vibrated again. David asked for a status report. Daniel replied that the protagonist was panicking, lying publicly, and that the family was fully entangled. He wrote that evidence was multiplying. The answer he received praised the situation and urged him to keep provoking them subtly. Daniel turned back to the family and suggested that, since Amanda had mentioned their time in college, perhaps they should all share some of those memories together. Amanda froze. Her parents noticed her panic and questioned whether she was feeling well. She insisted she was only tired, trying to mask the panic rising in her throat. Daniel responded kindly, saying that important days could reveal unexpected truths and that the weight of past decisions sometimes made celebrations more complicated. The colonel finally lost patience, announcing that Sheriff Martinez would arrive within minutes to remove Daniel by force. Daniel checked his phone again and replied that the sheriff might be occupied this evening with urgent federal matters. His tone carried a certainty that startled everyone. Amanda's panic deepened. She understood now that Daniel had arrived not as an unwanted guest, but as someone carrying information she thought she had buried forever. Federal investigations. Secrets resurfacing. Truth clawing its way into the open. Amanda's entire world began to collapse before her eyes. The ballroom fell into an uneasy silence as Amanda tried to regain control of the situation. She took a hesitant step toward Daniel, desperately attempting to appear composed, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. She suggested they speak privately, as though a conversation hidden from the guests might somehow undo the unraveling she had caused years earlier. Daniel remained calm, answering with a tone that made it clear he understood exactly what she was trying to prevent. Before Amanda could say more, the colonel raised his voice again, insisting that the sheriff would arrive at any moment to remove Daniel from the premises. But Daniel simply checked his phone and remarked that Sheriff Martinez might be preoccupied with certain federal matters that evening. The words carried a subtle warning, enough to send a ripple of confusion through the family. The colonel stiffened, uncertain for the first time. Amanda's panic deepened. She had spent years trying to bury the past, believing her choices would never resurface. She had married into a wealthy family, surrounded herself with status and privilege, convinced that the world she had built was unshakable. But Daniel's presence alone had already cracked it, and every moment was widening the fracture. Daniel scanned the room as he quietly reviewed the digital files on his device. 8 months of investigation, 3 years of preparation, and several hours of real-time evidence collected during the wedding. He had everything he needed. His phone buzzed again. A new message appeared with a single line that made his eyes sharpen with purpose. A federal warrant had been approved. The operation was authorized. The final phase was ready to begin. He replied that all the protagonists were gathered and that the evidence was complete. Amanda watched his expression shift, and her breath caught in her throat. She understood. This was not about a social confrontation or an awkward reunion. This was something much larger, something that would consume every person involved. Daniel slipped his phone away as the ballroom doors opened. Sheriff Martinez stepped inside, ready to carry out the colonel's request. But the moment he saw Daniel, his face drained of color. He addressed Daniel with a trembling voice, calling him by a title that silenced the entire hall. Advocate General Washington. Mrs. Coleman looked from the sheriff to Daniel, confused and frightened. She asked what federal operation was being referenced, her voice losing its edge for the first time. Daniel rose from his seat with deliberate calm, his posture shifting from that of an outsider to a man standing fully in his authority. He introduced himself properly, stating his full name and position as Advocate General in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. The room froze. Even the music seemed to quiet itself in shock. Guests murmured in disbelief as the official identification passed from hand to hand. Amanda collapsed into a chair, her entire body trembling. Margaret Whitfield whispered that he was too young for such a title, then added something far more revealing. She insisted it was impossible because he was black. Daniel acknowledged the statement without anger, responding with quiet certainty that he was, in fact, both young and black, and had been responsible for federal civil rights investigations in the state for 3 years. Every lie, every slight, every act of discrimination committed against him that night now stood exposed against the truth of who he really was. Amanda tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. Daniel addressed her directly, asking whether she wished for him to remain silent about the evidence she had falsified in the Harrison housing case years earlier, or the bribes she had accepted from Whitfield Construction, or the illegal denials she had participated in that destroyed the futures of 17 families. Amanda shook her head helplessly. The guests around her gasped, their shock deepening with every sentence Daniel revealed. Robert, the groom, turned toward his new wife in horror. He demanded to know what Daniel was talking about. Amanda tried to explain, but her excuses fell apart before they could form. Daniel continued, laying out her role as an in-house lawyer for Coleman Enterprises during her college years, detailing how she had helped draft discriminatory contracts that kept minority families out of the company's developments, and listing the secret payments she had received to ensure that certain neighborhoods remained untouched by diversity. The colonel attempted to regain control, dismissing Daniel's claims as baseless. But Daniel signaled to Sheriff Martinez, who nodded. In that moment, federal agents entered the ballroom quietly but firmly, surrounding the exits. Their presence erased any remaining illusion that the situation could be contained. Daniel informed the colonel that he was under federal investigation for violating the Fair Housing Act, conspiring to deprive citizens of their civil rights, and laundering money through the family's construction company. Robert slowly stepped away from Amanda, disbelief twisted across his face. He had married a woman who had hidden a past darker than anything he could have imagined. Daniel read aloud from official documents, describing the discriminatory housing practices Amanda had implemented. Amanda broke down completely, insisting she had been young, that she had been told the practices were legal, that she had not understood the consequences. Daniel answered that she had denied more than 800 applications based solely on criteria disguised as cultural suitability, a phrase exposed in internal emails as a code for keeping out undesirable ethnic groups. Robert placed his wedding ring on the table and turned away from Amanda as agents moved in to secure the room. Daniel continued directing the operation with a steady calm. Sheriff Martinez approached to report that the backup servers had been located and that all email records for the past 5 years were being copied according to Daniel's instructions. Federal accountants were cataloging documents, and 3 safes had already been opened. Amanda looked around the ballroom in utter desperation. The guests who had judged Daniel hours earlier now stared at her with disbelief and shame. Even they could see that the empire she had built on lies was collapsing before her eyes. Daniel reminded the family that every action had been documented and that the consequences they now faced were the direct result of their choices. The federal agents moved quietly, collecting devices and escorting individuals for questioning. The truth had arrived in the most public way possible, and there was no escaping it now. The colonel made one final attempt to defend his family, insisting that Daniel had no authority to conduct federal operations on private property. Daniel responded with absolute calm and signaled to one of the agents, who handed him an official folder. Inside was a federal search and seizure warrant, signed earlier that afternoon by a federal judge. Daniel read its contents aloud, explaining that the order authorized a complete search of the premises, including financial records, correspondence, and all electronic devices linked to Coleman Enterprises and its discriminatory practices. Sheriff Martinez approached again and reported that 3 safes had been found in the home office and opened. Federal accountants were cataloging every document, file, and ledger inside. Additional agents were securing digital backups, ensuring no evidence could be erased. The wedding guests stared in disbelief as they realized this was not a misunderstanding or a social dispute. It was a federal operation in full force. Amanda looked around the room, tears streaming down her face. Everyone she had hoped to impress, every social connection she had worked so hard to secure, now watched her as a criminal. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Amanda pulled away, overwhelmed by fear and humiliation. The weight of her choices finally crushed her. The family reputation she had tried so desperately to uphold was unraveling faster than she could breathe. Daniel watched quietly as the consequences unfolded. He had not come to ruin a wedding. He had come to expose a system that thrived on discrimination and entitlement. Every insult he had endured that evening had only strengthened the case. Every whisper, every cold stare, every exclusion had built a foundation of evidence that showed the depth of the prejudice rooted in that family and their business. Federal agents continued their work. Devices were collected from guests who might hold relevant information. Phones were placed into evidence bags. Laptops were set aside for examination. Margaret Whitfield attempted to slip away, but two agents stopped her gently and informed her that she would need to stay for questioning. Her construction company was one of the central pieces of the investigation. Margaret protested, insisting she had done nothing wrong, but Daniel explained clearly that her company was involved in systematic discrimination, misuse of federal funds, and bribery of public officials. She went silent, her confidence collapsing under the truth. One of the guests tried to record the scene with her phone, but an agent approached and asked her to turn it over as part of the ongoing operation. The guest hesitated, but the agent gently reminded her that this was now a federal matter. Amanda collapsed into a chair, whispering that this would destroy their family, their company, everything they had built. Daniel reminded her that she should have considered that before choosing to participate in illegal and discriminatory practices that harmed countless families. Robert took several steps back from Amanda, unable to accept the person he had just married. He stared at her in disbelief, asking how she could hide something so monstrous. Amanda tried to reach for him, but he pulled away, shaking his head. Her wedding ring glittered against her trembling hand, a symbol of a life already slipping away. Every guest in the ballroom could feel the collapse of an empire built on prejudice. And Daniel watched, not with pride, but with the steady resolve of a man who understood that justice often arrives in quiet, uncompromising steps. Federal agents escorted the key individuals toward separate rooms for questioning. The elegant ballroom, once filled with music and celebration, now resembled the scene of a truth long ignored. Guests who had spent the evening whispering judgments about Daniel now whispered about the Colemans instead, their faces pale with shock. Daniel checked his watch. The operation had unfolded exactly as planned. Years of investigation, months of preparation, hours of careful documentation during the wedding. Everything had aligned with precision. The case that had begun with unjustly denied housing applications and buried evidence had now become a national example of what systemic discrimination looked like behind polished doors and smiling faces. Amanda was placed in handcuffs, still wearing her wedding dress. The image was surreal. The same guests who had avoided Daniel only hours earlier now avoided looking at her. She kept her head down, her tears staining the lace she had once been so proud to wear. As she passed the waitstaff, they exchanged quiet glances. They had seen everything that night. The humiliation, the arrogance, the cruelty. And now they watched the consequences unfold in full. Outside, unmarked federal vehicles waited to transport those under arrest. Agents guided the detainees with professionalism, ensuring the process remained orderly. Amanda's parents followed in stunned silence. Robert refused to accompany them, unable to reconcile the truth with the woman he had married only hours before. Daniel stood near the entrance as the agents finalized their work. He instructed Martinez to gather contact information from all guests for possible testimony. This investigation, he explained, extended far beyond the Coleman family. It would uncover networks, partnerships, hidden agreements, and every person who had benefited from discriminatory systems disguised as business practices. When the final detainees were escorted out, Daniel walked through the ballroom one last time. The celebration had ended, but something far more important had begun. Justice, long suppressed, had finally stepped into the light. And the echo of that moment would travel far beyond the walls of the Grand Palace. Months passed. Daniel sat in his Washington office, watching a news report announcing the bankruptcy of Coleman Enterprises. The anchor detailed the collapses that followed. Amanda Coleman had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Sheriff Martinez had been removed from office. Margaret Whitfield had lost her construction company and faced personal bankruptcy. Colonel Coleman, once powerful and respected, now spent his remaining years paying federal fines that consumed the entire family fortune. Robert had annulled the marriage in record time and disappeared from public view. The Grand Palace Ballroom itself had lost its license after investigators uncovered long-standing discriminatory practices woven into its operations. Daniel set the report aside and opened a handwritten letter from Jennifer Martinez, the former sheriff's daughter. She thanked him for uncovering the truth, explaining that her family could now rebuild from honesty rather than corruption. Dozens of similar letters arrived each week. People whose lives had been affected by the investigation. People who had been denied homes, opportunities, or dignity. Daniel read every message, knowing each one represented a life moved toward justice. A photograph arrived during the holidays. 17 families, smiling proudly in front of new homes built with funds recovered from the Coleman case. Children laughed in the yards where denied dreams had finally taken root. Daniel placed the photo on his desk, knowing it represented the true purpose of his work. The investigation he led became a national model for uncovering systemic housing discrimination. Policies changed. New cases opened. Communities once silenced found their voices again. Daniel remembered the wedding clearly. The dismissive stares, the whispered insults, the attempts to push him aside. They had tried to make him feel small because of his color. Instead, they had revealed the smallness of their own character. Justice does not always arrive in noise. Sometimes it works quietly, steadily, and with a resolve that echoes across generations. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable wedding. Daniel sat in his office in Washington, surrounded by quiet light and the steady hum of distant traffic. On the screen before him, a news anchor summarized once again the impact of the largest civil rights investigation the state had seen in decades. Coleman Enterprises had collapsed entirely, forced into bankruptcy under the weight of its own crimes. Former Sheriff Martinez had been removed from public office. Margaret Whitfield had lost her construction empire, stripped of every illicit advantage she had used to rise in society. Amanda Coleman, once celebrated for her poise and ambition, was now serving a federal prison sentence of 5 years. Her name had become synonymous with discrimination and corruption. Daniel listened without emotion, simply absorbing the final steps in a journey he had begun long before that wedding night. He knew the story did not end with a single courtroom decision or a financial collapse. Justice, real justice, was a process. It crept through systems, exposed truths, and reshaped futures piece by piece. A knock sounded on his door. An assistant entered quietly, placing a small stack of letters on his desk. Many came from families affected by the case. Some came from people who had worked in the systems he had dismantled. Others arrived from community leaders who had been waiting years for someone to reveal what had been happening behind closed doors. He opened one envelope carefully. The handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant. It was from Jennifer Martinez, the former sheriff's daughter. She wrote that her family was rebuilding, that the truth had been painful but liberating, and that she believed her father finally understood the consequences of the path he had chosen. She thanked Daniel for giving them a chance to start over with transparency and honesty. Daniel set the letter aside and reached for another envelope. Inside was a photograph. 17 families stood side by side in front of newly built homes, homes financed with the federal funds recovered from the Coleman investigation. Mothers held toddlers in warm coats. Children laughed in yards where there had once been only fences keeping opportunities away. Fathers stood with pride in their posture, knowing their families finally had a place to call their own. The image felt like a breath of fresh air in a world that often held far too many shadows. He placed the photograph on his desk, letting it rest as a reminder that justice was never abstract. It always landed in real lives, in real homes, in real futures. It was the quiet answer to loud injustices, the steady hand guiding communities forward after generations of exclusion. Reports continued flashing across his screen about new investigations inspired by the Coleman case. Other states were reopening files long ignored. Administrators who had hidden behind bureaucracy were being held accountable. People who had been told their voices did not matter were now stepping forward, sharing stories that echoed across cities and counties. The country was listening. Daniel leaned back in his chair, not with triumph but with a calm certainty that the work was far from over. Justice was never a single moment. It was a continuous effort, a promise renewed again and again. And he intended to honor that promise in every case he touched. He thought back to that night in the grand ballroom, the night when every whisper and glance had tried to diminish him. The memory no longer carried the sting of humiliation. Instead, it carried clarity. The people who had judged him so quickly had exposed their own prejudice, not his worth. Their attempts to make him feel small had only revealed the limits of their own character. The waiter who had ignored him that evening now worked in a federal reintegration program that Daniel personally oversaw. On his first day, the young man had approached him with humility, admitting he had learned that dignity was not determined by color or status. Daniel remembered offering him reassurance, reminding him that growth began the moment someone chose honesty over habit. The ripple effects of the Coleman investigation spread far beyond the courtroom. Advocacy groups referenced Daniel's work as a turning point. Law schools used the case to teach students about systemic discrimination and the impact of legal perseverance. Community organizations wrote letters describing how the investigation had restored trust in a justice system that had long felt distant and unresponsive. Daniel understood the deeper lesson hidden within the narrative of that wedding. Justice did not always announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it entered quietly, disguised as patience. Sometimes it followed a man who walked into a ballroom where he was unwelcome, carrying only a simple suit, a calm expression, and a truth powerful enough to change everything. He looked once more at the photograph on his desk. Children smiling in front of new homes. Families standing in places they had once been denied. Futures beginning where injustice had tried to close doors. That was the real victory. Not the downfall of the Colemans, not the headlines or the courtroom triumphs, but the rebuilt lives, the restored dignity, the new chapters waiting to be written. The echo of that wedding night would not fade. It would resonate in every community that had ever been told they were less. It would stand as proof that justice, though often slow, eventually arrives with undeniable force. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet fill the room. The world outside kept moving, and so would he. There were more battles ahead, more truths to uncover, more families to protect. Justice would continue its work, step by step, case by case, voice by voice. And Daniel Washington, the man once pushed aside at a wedding, would be there to carry it forward.